Then we're going to be reading Deuteronomy 12, verses 1 through 14. These are the statutes and rules that you shall be careful to do in the land that the Lord, the God of your fathers, has given you to possess all the days that you live on the earth. You shall surely destroy all the places where the nations whom you shall dispossess served their gods, on the high mountains and on the hills and under every green tree. You shall tear down their altars and dash in pieces their pillars and burn their Asherim with fire. You shall chop down the carved images of their gods and destroy their name out of that place. You shall not worship the Lord your God in that way, but you shall seek the place that the Lord your God will choose out of all your tribes to put his name and make his habitation there. There you shall go, and there you shall bring your burnt offerings and your sacrifices, your tithes and the contribution that you present, your vow offerings, your free will offerings, and the firstborn of your herd and of your flock. And there you shall eat before the Lord your God, and you shall rejoice, you and your households, in all that you undertake, in which the Lord your God has blessed you. You shall not do according to all that we are doing here today, everyone doing whatever is right in his own eyes. For you have not as yet come to the rest and the inheritance that the Lord your God is giving you. But when you go over the Jordan and live in the land that the Lord your God is giving you to inherit, and when he gives you rest from all your enemies around, so that you live in safety, then to the place that the Lord your God will choose to make his name dwell there, there you shall bring all that I command you, your burnt offerings and your sacrifices, your tithes and the contribution that you present, and all your finest vow offerings that you vow to the Lord. And you shall rejoice before the Lord your God, you and your sons and your daughters, your male servants and your female servants, and the Levite that is within your towns, since he has no portion of or inheritance with you. Take care that you do not offer your burnt offerings at any place you see, but at the place that the Lord will choose in one of your tribes, there you shall offer your burnt offerings, and there you shall do all that I am commanding you. This is the word of the Lord.
Well, good morning, everybody. I'm Water. I'm one of the leaders here to copy Dustin's phrase. And I want to release the kids. They did that preemptively. Okay. And then 2, on your seats, you're going to see some Connect cards. If you are new, visiting, have prayer requests, or honestly just want to use them for some notes, please use them, utilize them. At the end, there's going to be an opportunity for you to hand them up to us so that we as a church can get to know you better and pray over you and the things that you need. But I also want to admit something really kind of sucky. I'm super tired right now. I'm super exhausted. And I could blame it on the fact that the past week I've been moving, and I am going to blame it on that. But it's not the act of moving that makes me tired. It's the concept of moving that makes me tired. I hate it. I absolutely hate it. When I was a kid, my parents were divorced before I was born, and they absolutely hated each other. And my mother told me once that she never wanted to live closer than half a country away from my father. And so my father had 3 houses through my whole childhood, always in Texas, and that's where I get my Texan identity. But my mother lived up and down the southeast coast, just about every southern state. And so between custody changes, summer visitations, holidays, financial struggles, I lived mostly everywhere and anywhere in the South. And there's something about being a child in that environment, having no agency and choice, that now when I think of moving, I hate it. I don't like the idea of packing up my memories, my friends, my comfort, my habits, and going to someplace new, because that right was taken away from me as a kid. And I know some people might share that, maybe have a different experience. The fact that I moved a lot was really because of this negative connotation with my parents. It had nothing really positive attached to it. And so now whenever I move, there's a part of me that I want to revert back into my childhood self and turn into that kid who hates this. And even though as an adult, I'm choosing to do this, even though as an adult, it's my choice and my actions and my agency that's causing a move, doesn't mean that when I put things into a box, that I don't have this little fear and terror cry up in my heart that tells me don't do this. That change is scary. That wasn't the story I actually planned to tell this morning. The past few weeks I've been thinking about this sermon. I was thinking about some funny things, but yesterday after we had great help and Katie and I were able to move into a new place, it took a lot faster than expected. And honestly, physically speaking, it was really easy. But as I'm sitting there going to bed last night and trying to finalize everything for this next week, I just found myself so emotionally drained. And as we talk through this Deuteronomy 12 text, I really want to focus on worship. But we also have to remember that Deuteronomy is at the climax of Israel vagrancy. They escaped slavery. They traveled 40 plus years in the desert. They experienced the death of a generation for disobedience. And now they're at the climax. They're at the river. They can see their promised land. And they've just spent their whole lives, many of them, just moving. And they have to figure out their new habits as they finish their transition from a coerced people with no agency, then a vagrant population with no home, and now being at the culmination of a destiny promised to one man long ago. And so I promise this will relate to worship. But I want us to have that mentality as we enter into this. So this is a culmination of a promise, the end of vagrancy, and after a lifetime and generations of traveling. So our question that we're going to answer today is, how do we worship God? And our map to find that answer begins with a breadcrumb trail. Potlucks are biblical. And then may the temple be with you. Some of you might already know that reference, but that will make sense later on. So we're going to begin at a breadcrumb trail. And the fairy tale Hansel and Gretel is two children exploring the woods. So they don't get lost. Hansel leaves a trail of breadcrumbs so they know their way back home. Unfortunately, animals, birds eat the breadcrumbs. They get lost. They meet a cannibal witch who tries to eat them. You know, the original fairy tale ends up with some pretty horrid descriptions. In the American modern fairy tale, good things happen, they get saved. But that story has nothing to do with the Israelites, except if you look at their history, especially when it comes to Genesis and Exodus, the Israelites left a breadcrumb of altars. As soon as Adam and Eve were kicked out of the garden, which at one time was the central place of the worship of God, that garden, that was a lot of Old Testament historians have kind of come to the consensus and understand that Garden of Eden, whether literal or figurative garden, was a temple dedicated to God, dedicated to Yahweh, where man and woman can meet with him one-on-one. And then we as people messed up, we got kicked out. So now when we wanted to meet with God one-on-one, we either had to do something unique or God had to come down to us. And whenever that happened, there was something significant where we would then make a temple to mark that instance. And so we can kind of see where the Hebrew people went and traveled throughout their generations, just by where they left altars. I'm going to lift off a few scripture references. I'll grade enough time for you to write them down. I encourage you to go back and read these. These are just a few instances throughout the Hebrew history where we can see temples. So in Genesis 8:20, it's the first mention of an altar. It's where Noah sacrificed animals after the flood subsided. Then Abraham built the second mentioned altar in Genesis 12:7 after he was given the location of the promised land. And then there was also an altar where Abraham was supposedly supposed to sacrifice Isaac, and then Isaac was substituted with the lamb. That altar was still utilized. Jacob who was eventually renamed as Israel, set up a stone and oil altar after he had his Jacob's ladder dream, where he saw that ladder to heaven. That is Genesis 28, 10 through 22. And then we're going to skip a little bit, just because there's a lot of altar references. Shifting to the Israelites, they built an altar just after escaping Egypt, just after crossing the Dead Sea. And then they went to war with the tribe of people called the Amalekites. And after winning, they created an altar to worship God. And that's Exodus 17:8. And we have this unique thing, too, while they're traveling. We know that the Israelites eventually set up a mobile altar, and they would set up altars as they went. So God observed this and said, hey, wait, I don't want you to be like other people. And so knowing that altar sacrifice was common for Israel and his neighbors, God tells the Israelites how to build his altars out of dirt and uncut stones with no steps in Exodus 20, 22 through 26. So that God's altars were unique among the gods of the region. And what that was important, because we know in that time frame, in that area where the Israelites lived and the time they lived in, that altars were man-made. Idols were man-made. These things that people created to represent their God were our imaginations being posed on the vision of a God. And God said, don't make an idol of me, but also don't make my altars out of your tools. Let them be the earth that I created. Let that be my altar. So if you're going to create an altar, build up a mound of dirt. Build up a mound of uncut stones. Don't put steps on it. Let it just be that raw creation I've already made. Moses builds an altar in Exodus 24:4 when Israel confirms their loyalty to God and his laws. And then we have a star altar, star by I mean like a big altar, where God says, hey, create something permanent in Exodus 27:1 through 8. And this is the altar of the tabernacle, which is a bronze altar. So it's one of the first altars that won't degrade to nature. It will stay there. It travels with the Israelites. They're supposed to clean it, maintain it, and perform all the rituals on it. The point is that whenever there was a significant event, or whenever God desired, the people of God would establish an altar for worship and remembrance. And so oftentimes, especially when we think of stones, Israel could look back on the land they came from and see all these sites years after they happened. They could be like, oh, we worship God there. And it's memorable. It's there. We know that was a place. But as we look to Deuteronomy and we're thinking about remembering, there is an element of pointing forward where no longer is this going to be the case. No longer will they be a vagrant people. They won't have to move. They'll live in the same land. They'll be able to populate and be blessed and grow and cultivate. But we have to understand, before we dig into this text proper, we do need to understand a little bit of altars and worship because it references something pretty substantial, and we have to understand why. So when we look at the ancient Near East, which is the academic term for the Israelite time and people, all their neighboring countries, there are two types of main worship centers. There was the outdoor shrines, and oftentimes these would be in the middle of public squares, communities of people, and they would just be out of convenience. People would gather, and they say, hey, here's a centralized place. Let's build some altars here. Let's build some shrines. Oftentimes there was multiple gods right next to each other, and a lot of times people just go God to God to God. But you had intermingling of worship practices, and there was sacrifices, and there were rituals. But this was just kind of like a geographic, convenient place. And then there were high places, locations of heightened elevation, where they would build full-on temples, and that's where your priesthoods would dwell. That's where the priests were like, oh, we're higher. We're closer to the realm of the gods. If you think of Mount Olympus, you're on the right track. It's where the gods dwelt, and so we have to go up there to meet with them. And so they would build full shrines and temples up there. And so we kind of have both of these altar types described in the ancient literature and in our text. And so with that in mind, let's kind of summarize what I just said, because there's kind of a lot of context. The Israelites had spent generations building altars as they traveled. And then also, we know that altar worship was common among their people, with the two types of altars, these geographically convenient outdoor shrines in the center of town, and then these high places where people would build full-on structures to try to meet with the gods at an elevated place. And so as we go into our text, trust me, we're still on breadcrumbs. As we go into our text, let's get in there. So in verse 1, 12:1, these are the statutes and the rules that you shall be careful to do in the land the Lord, the God of your fathers, has given you to possess. All the days that you live on the earth, you shall surely destroy all the places where the nations whom you shall dispossess serve their gods, on the high mountains and on the hills and under every green tree. You shall tear down their altars and dash in pieces their pillars and burn their Asherim with fire. You shall chop down their carved images of their God and destroy their name out of that place. You shall not worship the Lord your God in that way. What we can take out of that is that God wanted something special. He said, destroy those outdoor shrines and those high places. They do not belong in my country. If this is the country of God, no other God can exist here. He says, when you dispossess these people, dispossess their religion, their culture, their everything. When you push them out, they no longer belong here because this is Israelite territory and this is God territory. This is the land where I dwell. What's unique about this is that oftentimes when people conquered another person's land, they viewed the gods of that land as associated with that land. So if I was to go destroy my neighbor's house, I would adopt parts of their religion because I believed that their God ruled that house. Here God's saying, don't believe that. I travel with you, and I'm choosing the place where I'm going to dwell. So tear everything down. Additionally, there was probably idol worship paraphernalia and images and idols. And so what's different about Israel is that neighboring religions would physically manipulate their idols and gain favor. They would engage in things like ritual sex, child sacrifice, some divinations, and just other forms of cult worship to try to make their gods happy and attain blessing. But God desired his worship to be unique and pure, and God's worship was to be radically contradictory to the religion surrounding Israel. As we continue, but you shall seek the place that the Lord your God will choose out of all your tribes to put his name and make his habitation there. There you shall go, and there you shall bring your burnt offerings and your sacrifices, your tithes and the contribution you present, your vow offerings, your freewill offerings, and the firstborn of your herd and flock. And there, remember, there, the place the Lord your God will choose, you shall eat before the Lord your God, and you shall rejoice, you and your households, in all that you undertake, in which the Lord your God has blessed you. I described how shrines and altars were located because either they were just convenient, they were just the center of town, or they were these magical high places. But God's saying, no, none of that. This is where I choose. I'm the God of this land, and you're going to worship me where I want. And this would be a place unique in all of Israel's tribes, and this would be a place worth traveling to. God says both of those things. You're going to come together, and it's going to be in a place that I describe, in a place that I will tell you. One of the interesting things, and this is kind of foreshadowing for what's going to happen later on, God doesn't really make explicit where this location is. He hints at it here. Well, the author of Deuteronomy hints at it here. It just says, hey, this exists. God will choose. But there's no real defined place. In fact, as we will talk about later, the Samaritans and the Jews fought over this place because they interpreted the Bible differently. And they're like, the Samaritans said, oh, it's this one place. And the Jews said, it's this others. And it's literally because God never actually said. It was this kind of human oomph that decided where it was going to be. There was also this validation in this text. Typical shrines and altars would be made valid when the God showed up. So I would build my shrine, I'd build my altar, I'd pray, God would show up. That would say, oh, this is a good place to worship. God validates his altars by saying, I'm going to tell you where it is so you know it's real before we build it. And this would be a common place for the gathering of all Israel in the presence of God. And this would be a place of reverence and remembrance, but also of joy and community for you and your households. We continue on saying, you shall not do according to all that we are doing here today, everyone doing whatever is right in his own eyes, for you have not yet come to the rest and the inheritance that the Lord your God is giving you. But when you go over the Jordan and live in the land that the Lord your God is giving you to inherit, and when he gives you rest from all your enemies around so that you live in safety, then to the place the Lord your God will choose to make his name dwell there you will bring all that I command you, your burnt offerings, your sacrifices, your tithes, and the contributions that you present, and all your finest vow offerings that you vow to the Lord. This is both prescriptive and descriptive for the Israelites. What it means is that Moses is prescribing that they need to purify their worship, but also the reason this command is given is because over Israelites' travels, it describes that the Israelites picked up customs and cultures and worship from other people that they interacted with. We know they spent decades in a desert traveling and fighting and warring with people. And they were, to a certain extent, cousins of these people. So it's very natural for them to say, oh, I really like that aspect of worship from this Canaanite I just killed. Let me take it. And God's saying, no, you need to remember that you're my people. And when we enter this space, leave all that behind. And the idea of a God-chosen place for himself to rest tells the Israelites that the promise has been fulfilled. The identification of this place of worship will serve and act as a mark for change in the history of Israelites, and how that God's presence will dwell where he chooses and not where Israel decides to rest. That's going to be the biggest difference. Everywhere God has been with Israel, we know throughout the 40 years that there was the pillar of cloud and the pillar of fire guiding them around, but now God is saying, no, I'm going to rest here, you gather around me. We're almost done with this text, a promise. And you shall rejoice before the Lord your God, you and your sons and your daughters, your male servants and your female servants, and the Levite that is within your towns, since he has no portion or inheritance with you. God's chosen locations to be a place of community where all can come and rejoice in the presence of God. The haves and the have-nots come equally. Those with inheritance, those without. And we can extend that to the poor and the wealthy, to those who traveled and those who are nearby. Everyone comes before God. There's a commentator called Eugene Merrill, and he describes this as the fact that, using some big language, the theocratic community conceived as a corporate entity for the purpose of covenant relationship must recognize and dramatize that fact by appearing regularly before Yahweh at his dwelling place. And it's literally, all that simplifies down to saying is that God wants a relationship with individuals and Israel as a whole. And to validate that, he says, come to me and worship. And that's that relationship. Come to me and worship. And as we finish off the text, take care that you do not offer your burnt offerings at any place that you see, but at the place the Lord will choose in one of your tribes. There you shall offer your burnt offerings, and there you shall do all that I am commanding you. God is telling Israel, we've heard it like 3 times in this passage, so obviously they don't get it, or God's really considering this important. Don't do like your neighbors. Do like I tell you to do. I require holiness. Be holy as I am holy. This is important. And this change, this crossing over the Jordan, is supposed to be a mark in your life. No longer are you a disparate people acting as vagrants, traveling around on a whim, trying to survive, and now you will be a settled people being able to thrive. Remember, obey, and live. As we read this law, this section specifically, we need to glean what the main messages are, mostly because we no longer have a tabernacle or a physical temple. We don't create altars, at least in the same way that the Israelites did. And so we have to come from this, like, how do we get out of this text? This is descriptive of a people, prescriptive for their worship, and we're, a few thousand years removed from this. But I kind of derive 3 things out of this. God's worship was to be unique and pure and in his presence. God's worship was to be a community event. And God's worship was to be where he chose, not where Israel chose, in the method that God ordained, not in the method that Israel felt was right. All this describes holiness. All this describes relationship with God. But all this tells us is that there's a right way and there's a wrong way to worship God, or else God wouldn't have to choose. So we're going to move on to our second part of the map, kind of elaborate and see where this comes into play and how do we operate in this. And so right now we're going to move on to potlucks are biblical. And so looking as how we don't have a dedicated temple to worship at, how are we supposed to worship God well? How are we supposed to be in community? How are we supposed to be joyous together? How are we supposed to be generous? We don't have this centralized location anymore. We don't have really a Jerusalem to navigate around. As I referenced earlier, the New Testament Israelites dealt with this issue of a God-chosen location with the Samaritans. Most Jews accepted Jerusalem as the place that God chose. A lot of times it's because that's where David and Solomon built and planned the temple. And God validated that by saying, David, you won't build it, but your son will. So there was a validation of that from God. But the Samaritans thought there was this mount called Mount Gerizim, and I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right, and that's okay, was God's chosen place. And it came out of Deuteronomy, because Deuteronomy 11:29 says, and when the Lord your God brings you into the land that you are entering to take possession of it, when God brings you and crosses the Jordan into the promised land, you shall set the blessing on Mount Gerizim and the curse on Mount Ebal. Are they not beyond the Jordan, west of the road, toward the going down of the sun, in the land of the Canaanites, who live in the Arabah, opposite Gilgal, beside the oak of Moreh? For you are to cross over the Jordan to go in possession of the land that the Lord your God is giving you. And when you possess it and live in it, you shall be careful to do all the statutes and rules I'm setting before you today. So the Samaritans thought, hey, God's reminding us of our law. He's saying when we cross the river, there's these two mountains. One's blessed, one's cursed. That blessing ought to be the place where we go worship God. It's a high place. It's a place that God chose and pointed out. It makes sense, right? Well, and the Jews, or the main Hebrew people, thought, no, God will eventually choose it. It became Jerusalem. And now we have this generational feud that exists, and eventually to the point that they consider themselves dirty and trash and scum, so that a Jew would not even talk to a Samaritan. And all it was a misinterpretation of Scripture and a little bit of genealogical mixing. So the Samaritans weren't pure Jews, but mostly the division and location. And this seems odd to us now. We live in a world where ethnicities intermingle, especially in the United States or other very populated areas where immigration and emigration is very common. But back then, there was this pseudo-xenophobia that was very ingrained in society, that you stayed with your kin. And if we look to the New Testament, Jesus interacts with this division over location in John 4:19-26 when he talks to the Samaritan woman. And we know the beginning of the conversation, Jesus asks this Samaritan woman, hey, get me some water out of this well. The Samaritan woman says, how can you talk to me, a Samaritan and a woman? So there's two elements in play. And then they have a conversation. Jesus says some things, and this woman says this, starting in verse 19. And the woman said to him, Jesus, Sir, I perceive that you are a prophet. Our fathers, the Samaritans, worshipped on this mountain, but you say that in Jerusalem is the place where people ought to worship. And Jesus said in response to her, Woman, believe me, the hour is coming when neither on this mountain nor in Jerusalem will you worship the Father. You worship what you do not know. We worship what we know, the Jews. For salvation is from the Jews. But the hour is coming and is now here when the true worshipers will worship the Father in spirit and in truth. For Father is seeking such people to worship him. God is spirit, and those who worship him must worship in spirit and in truth. The woman then said to him, I know that Messiah is coming, he who is called Christ. When he comes, he will tell us all things. And Jesus finishes that conversation with saying to her, I who speak to you am he. And I chose this passage not because it just stresses this concept of the fact that Deuteronomy never specified where this location would be, and we see a feud happening in the Jewish people because of it, but because the way Jesus talks about this parallels this Deuteronomy passage and a lot of it. He declares himself as God. So anything here he says now, God chooses. So just like in Deuteronomy, God is choosing where his place dwells. He validates that a location does exist. He does say, the mountain and Jerusalem doesn't matter in reality, but Jerusalem's right because salvation comes from the Jews. But that it won't matter much longer. He switches the location of worship now from a temple to a people. He says, if you worship me in spirit and truth, that's true worship. The location doesn't matter as much. And in that, he then invalidates Jerusalem's location by stating that God as spirit was never contained there anyway. He says the location was good. It served its purpose. It gave you a place to focus on, but God was spirit. He could never fully live in a building anyway. And then he sums up this conversation, just like I mentioned at the beginning. He validates by these changes by saying he is Messiah and God. So just like in Deuteronomy, Jesus says, I am God, here are my choices. Here's where you're going to worship me. The difference between Deuteronomy and here is that where in Deuteronomy we have this gathering at a specific location. Jesus says, now that location is in spirit and in truth. It is in your heart, it is in you. I've changed it from a temple, this geography, to a people and a person. And so that answers that question, how do we worship God well in spirit and truth? Well, that's a really simplistic answer because that doesn't really tell you what is spirit and truth. What does it mean to worship God in spirit and truth? But that's the answer to our question. And then how does this relate to potlucks? When we look at Deuteronomy 12, there's a reoccurring theme of when you gather together with your household, with your slaves, your servants, with your Levites. You gather together in community, being joyous and generous. Jesus made sure there was always community around him. He called 12 disciples. Of course, it was imagery representing the 12 tribes of Israel, but in reality, that was a community he brought around him. And then as we look at the early church, many times people and pastors kind of say, oh, Acts 2:42 through 47. That should be a familiar text if you lived in the evangeli world. That's where that trail came from. I'm sorry. I'm the problem. It's me. I'm going to try my hardest not to become a miniature Dustin. All right. When we look at how God's people are to worship in spirit and truth, many think of how the early church did it. And Acts 2:42 through 47 is often used in the description of this. There's a little bit of spasms in my head. When I admit that I'm tired and emotionally exhausted, I am also tired and emotionally exhausted. So please please bear with me. Please give me grace. I am trying to give you what you deserve. And they devoted themselves to the apostles' teaching and the fellowship, to the breaking of bread and the prayers, and all came upon every soul. Many wonders and signs were being, I mistyped that. Done. Okay, not done. Done through the apostles. And all who believed were together and had all things in common, and they were selling their possessions and belonging and distributing the proceeds to all, and as any had need. And day by day, attending the temple together and breaking bread in their homes, they received their food with glad and generous hearts, praising God and having favorable will with all the people. And the Lord added to their number daily. And we see everything that Deuteronomy 12 describes. We see community gatherings. We see the teaching of God and will, that remembrance. We see God's presence as proven by miracles and community. We see a common people sharing everything, their lifestyles, their possessions, their money, their food. We see generosity so that no one had need. Everyone was thriving. We see continued cult worship of God through the temple gathering. They never denied it. They were like, oh, the temple still exists. We're still going to do it. We see a sharing of food. And most of all, we see rejoicing. And I think that last line in that passage, and the Lord added to the number daily. I think this passage kind of gives us a cause and effect. And we have this huge cause. They gathered, they learned, they studied, they were generous, they shared, they gave up their wealth. And because of this fulfillment, the Lord added to the number daily. Because when people follow God's will, the blessing is a growing community focus on God. And this describes what it means to worship God with spirit and truth. It describes a community intent on God's will. It describes a community intent on loving each other well. It describes a community intent on being God's people. And when all those are together, just as we spoke about last week, of loving God with all our heart, our soul, and our might, that oomph, when all that comes together, we now create a community based on people. We create a community of people focused on God's will. And that's what it means to worship God in spirit and in truth. As Jesus showed us with the Samaritan woman, the geographic location doesn't matter as much as the intent and heart of God's people. The New Testament author spoke on this a little bit more and showed us how this is to make sense. Why is it possible to worship in spirit and in truth now when the Israelites had a location they were supposed to pilgrim to? That leads us to our final point, and may the temple be with you. In Star Wars, we know of the magical presence of the Force that exists in anyone and everyone, and especially the Jedis. They would walk around, and it was a common thing to say, "May the Force be with you," because they believed that everyone had it, and you just needed to reach out and recognize it. But Hebrew 9 kind of shows us that the temple, the God-chosen location of worship, was to be a physical representation of our hearts. It was never supposed to be a geography in its culmination. It was supposed to be a mirroring of what's going on inside of us. So in Hebrews 9:23 through 24, the author writes, "Thus it was necessary for the copies of the heavenly things to be purified with these rites, but the heavenly things themselves with better sacrifices than these. For Christ has entered not only into holy places made with hands, which are copies of the true things, but into heaven itself, now to appear in the presence of God on our behalf." So the author says right now, all those ritual worship practices, all those sacrifices were just supposed to be a copy. They're supposed to be something we didn't fully understand yet, a physical something that we can hold on to, because people understand it's easier for us to think about something right in front of us than to try to imagine something in our head. But the author continues, what is the full revelation of these copies? So going into Hebrews 10, "For since the law has but a shadow of the good thing to come instead of the true form of these realities, it can never, by the same sacrifices that are continually offered every year, make perfect those who draw near. Otherwise would they not have ceased to be offered, since the worshippers, having once been cleansed, would no longer have any consciousness of sins. But in these sacrifices there is a reminder for sins every year, for it is impossible for the blood of bulls and goats to take away sins. Consequently, when Christ came into the world, he said, 'Sacrifices and offerings you, God, have not desired, but a body you have prepared for me. In burnt offerings and sin offerings you have taken no pleasure. Then I said, Behold, I have come to do your will, O God, as it is written for me in the scroll of the book.' And when he, Jesus, said above, 'You have neither desired nor taken pleasure in sacrifices and offerings and burnt offerings and sin offerings, and these are offered according to the law,' then he added, 'Behold, I have come to do your will.' He does away with the first order to establish the second. And by that we have been sanctified through the offering of the body of Jesus Christ once and for all. And every priest stands at his daily service, offering repeatedly the same sacrifices, which can never take away sins. But when Christ had offered for all time a single sacrifice for sins, he sat down at the right hand of God, waiting from that time until his enemies should be made a footstool for his feet. For by a single offering he has perfected for all time those who are being sanctified. And the Holy Spirit also bears witness to us, for the saying, 'This is the covenant that I will make with them. After those days, declare the Lord, I will put my law on their hearts and write them on their minds.' And then he adds, 'I will remember their sins and their lawless deeds no more.' Where there's forgiveness of sins and these sins, there's no longer any offering for sin." We have this big statement that's saying, these things, these rituals, these worship practices, this location was designed to represent something in the heavenly realms that is more true and more pure and more holy than we as humans can grasp. Jesus came to fulfill that. His sacrifice created a way that now we can realize what it means to fear God, to worship God in spirit and in truth. The Israelites commonly, you read the rest of Deuteronomy and all the Torah, there was a schedule of sacrifices and gatherings and rejoicing and generosity, but it was always scheduled, and oftentimes it was because they sinned and they needed to come purify themselves before God. Jesus now does that for us. He says, hey, the way you worshiped was a copy, it was an image, was a representation. Now let me purify that. Let me make it real. Let me put it inside of you, and you no longer have to sit inside these rituals. And I want to focus on the middle of that. There was this is the covenant that I will make with them. After those days, declared the Lord, I will put my laws in their hearts and write them on their minds, just like Jesus said to the Samaritan woman, in spirit and in truth. Now the laws in our hearts and our minds, unable to be taken away. No longer do I have to travel to a specific location to worship God. No longer am I bound by a yearly sacrifice. I'm able to have it just right here inside of me in relationship with the one who loves me. The Hebrews tell us that the God-chosen location wasn't complete in its purpose. The location, purity, and rituals were intended to create a people with a law in their hearts. But Jesus came to show us that the true purpose of God's laws and to increase our relationship with God and his law. And that's what we see in Deuteronomy 12. We see a description of how Israel was supposed to worship God, community, generosity, regularly, together, with joy. We see how the early church did that too after Jesus came and sacrificed himself. Community, generosity, regularly, and with joy. And we all know that the intention of the old practices was to show us a reflection of the new, so that we could understand it one way and then have it more realized later on. And as we look at these things and ponder how we can worship God well in spirit and in truth, there are those who hear this message and accept that true worship comes from God changing their hearts, and will take it to the nth degree and ignore the community joy, generosity, and discipleship aspect of the gospel, thinking to themselves, God knows my heart, I can worship him in this way and that way. Or I don't need community, life group, or church, I can pursue God myself. Because God's now here. I don't need anyone else. I don't need community to meet with God. Luckily, Hebrews tells us that in chapter 10, 24 through 25, and let us consider how to stir up one another to love and good works, not neglecting to meet together, as is the habit of some, but encouraging one another, and all the more as you see the day drawing near. Yes, the location of worship is translated to our hearts, but it was always supposed to be a community ordeal. If you are worshiping alone, solely, if you are worshiping alone and that is your only form of worship with God, I strongly encourage you to find a community that you can worship together with. I fear that you will go wayward. I fear that you will read something on your own and not be balanced out by the community of believers and think of something oddly and end up not worshiping God well. It is that balance of individuality and community aspect that creates a people of God who understand Jesus' gospel. On the flip side, others hear this message and are convinced of community. They convince that, we should come to church regularly. I should be in community regularly. But then they say you have to be perfect before you can enter in. Jesus tells us in Matthew 4:19, he's talking to the calling of disciples, follow me, and I will make you fishers of men. Follow Jesus first, and he will transform you into his will for your life. Follow me, and I will make you fishers of men. You do not need to be holy to start following me. I will transform you. So if we end up neglecting community because we push people out because we need them to fix themselves before we can enter in, we're committing the same mistake as the people who think they don't need community at all. The band can go ahead and come up if they'd like. The gospel we get to follow says that surrendering our will to God and following his desire for our life results in a transformation of our hearts that leads to community, generosity, joy, and a will to see others transformed too. So if you all would stand up with me. Thank you for walking this morning with me. We're going to enter into a time of communion where we get to engage in a Christian ritual, mimicking an old Israelite ritual. So as we sing and as we play, there's some of the communion elements in the back. Please take your time throughout the song and we'll get them as you feel ready. Additionally, if you filled out a Connect card with prayer requests, needs, or even just interest in how you can get more involved, there's a gold bowl where you can offer financial giving or those Connect cards. If you feel like you want to give online, we have an online portal talk to one of the leaders and we can make sure you get that. But thank you all for coming. Thank you all for listening. And I'm going to pray us out. Jesus, your heart is to see people transformed and have a community that loves you. I ask that you impose on our hearts a desire for your will and your law, so that it's not our choice that guides our direction, but a reflection of the character that you showed us in your words and in your life. Let us pursue you well, both individually and in community, so that we can represent your people the way you intended and the way you died for. And I pray this over us in Jesus' name. Amen.